The four of them, Eva, Marcus, Dina, and Will, huddled together on the moonlit driveway, their breaths white in the cool October air. Neither spoke as they looked around the house, a two-story relic of rotten clapboard and broken windows, empty for as long as either of them could remember. On Halloween night, the place seemed more alive than ever. The shabby shutters flapped slightly, as if beckoning the group inside. It was Marcus's idea. He kept talking about making this Halloween unforgettable. Eva was hesitant. She insisted on just having a movie night or going to a big school party. Dina and Will hadn't expressed much of an opinion at all until tonight, when they quietly followed Marcus through the overgrown yard, hearts pounding. The cold wind whipped their faces, bringing the distant laughter of children begging for sweets somewhere down the block. But the distant merriment of their neighbors seemed like the whole world to them. Something about this house made every shadow feel wary. The porch boards creaked underfoot, and the front door was slightly ajar. Each of them had their own reasons for coming here, secrets they carried that none of the group understood. Marcus, especially, was full of nervous energy, as if he had excitement burning under his skin. When he pushed the door open, the corridor behind it seemed more like a maw. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" whispered Eva, her voice sounding thin and hollow against the creeping darkness inside. She thought she heard movement near the stairs, but maybe it was just her imagination. Her heart refused to slow down its frantic pounding. "Relax, it'll be fun," Marcus said with a worried smile. His eyes darted from corner to corner. She couldn't tell if he was being brave or if there was something in his eyes that she didn't want to name a kind of hunger. They went out into the foyer. Faint moonlight seeped through the torn curtains, enough to see the shabby wallpaper peeling off in strips. The air smelled of dampness, dirt, and rotten leaves. A mirror hanging crookedly on the wall reflected the ghostly outlines of their silhouettes. For a moment, Will froze, convinced that he saw something behind them in the reflection an additional figure. But when he looked back, only the shadows stared back. Then, past the broken furniture and scattered debris, they found the living room, where a battered couch stood in front of a blackened brick fireplace. The group hovered in the doorway, waiting uncertainly. Each of the friends felt like an intruder, and perhaps they were. But it was not only that. It seemed that something lived within these walls, something that was waiting for them. Marcus finally broke the silence. "This is the perfect place," he sighed, "for what we have to do tonight." No one asked him to elaborate. Everyone felt a crackle of anticipation in the air. Something about the way he said it gave them a collective chill. Dina reached for Eva's hand, just for a second to reassure her, but Eva pulled away, her eyes fixed on the dark corridor leading deeper into the house. The floor creaked again. The wind from outside picked up, slamming against the loosely closed window. It felt like the house was breathing around them, watching, waiting. A dull knock came from upstairs. Instantly, their group fell silent, their hearts clenched in their chests. It wasn't just Oldwood settling, it was deliberate, like footsteps. Or someone dropped something heavy on the floor. And although none of them said it out loud, a question grew in each of their minds. If we are alone in this house, who or what just made this noise? They stood there, not daring to move, until Marcus broke into a shaky smile. "See," he whispered. "I told you this place was perfect." A faint scraping sound came from somewhere behind the walls. And then a whispering started. Or maybe it was just the wind. They couldn't be sure. But the promise of horror lingered, invisibly curling around their feet like a creeping fog. Breathlessly, they set out to find out who or what was with them. Little did they know that by the end of the night, the game they were playing would take them somewhere much darker than any of them could have imagined. And that not all of them would come out of it in one piece, or even come out at all. They made their way deeper into the house, following the dull thuds and muffled grinding. The old floorboards groaned underfoot, the sound echoing in the dim, dusty corridors. The whole place felt like a trap, each crooked wall directing them into what lay ahead. At the foot of the stairs, Marcus took the lead. Even though Eva tugged at his sleeve in protest, he pushed forward with a single-minded persistence that neither Dina nor Will had ever seen in him before. She whispered his name, but Marcus pushed her away with a finger to his lips. Then, one by one, they climbed the rickety stairs. At the top, a corridor stretched to the left and right. It was lined with closed doors. Each of them looked warped and water-damaged, their hinges rusted. The air smelled of mold and something else, something musty. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, buzzing slightly with electricity. How it was still working after all these years was anyone's guess, and its flickering glow cast strange shadows that seemed to grow and shrink around them. Will picked up the flashlight and shone it around to chase away the darkness. Dina hovered close behind him. There was another muffled knock, this time seeming to come from the farthest door. As the group approached it, they all stopped as Marcus took hold of the handle. "It's locked," he said, his voice strained with frustration when the door didn't turn. "Good," Eva whispered. "We don't need to open it." Marcus looked at her sternly. "Yes, we do." It took a few good shoves with his shoulder, but the old door finally gave way with a crack. A stream of stale air rushed in, along with a palpable shiver of cold. As soon as they stepped inside, Eva and Dina sucked in a frightened breath. Scraps of cloth, blackened candle stubs, and an incomplete circle drawn in chalk around a fire mark were scattered on the floor. Eerie symbols were smeared on the walls, some resembling rough faces, others twisted runes. In the center of the burned circle was a small wooden box, partially open. Marcus knelt down by the chalk circle, holding out his hand. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," he muttered under his breath, so quietly that only Will, who was standing closest, could hear him. The words sent a shiver down Will's spine, and Dina stopped at the threshold, not sure whether to follow him. Dina couldn't take her eyes off the walls. The smeared symbols looked ominously fresh, as if someone had drawn them only a few minutes ago. Eva, on the other hand, had her eyes fixed on the wooden box. She didn't want Marcus to touch it, but she couldn't bring herself to speak either. Something in the box seemed alive, quietly pulsating with fear. Marcus pushed the lid further back, revealing an old leather-bound book inside. Its cover was carved with the same strange markings as the walls, and the pages, wrinkled and yellowed, unfolded under his fingers. He looked at the others, his eyes blazing with feverish excitement. "Do you see?" he whispered. "Isn't it incredible?" His hand hovered over the text, and the moment his fingers touched the symbols, a soft moan seemed to sweep through the room. It was not a sound made by any of them. It was the house or something inside it reacting to this long-forgotten object. The only bare light bulb in the hallway sputtered, flooding everything around with frantic strobe-like flashes. Eva finally found her voice. "Marcus, put it down." He didn't. Instead, he turned another page, and with each fragile sheet he turned, the atmosphere thickened with a foreboding that clutched them all. Will stepped back, his throat tightening as if invisible hands were squeezing him. Dina's gaze continued to slide toward the door, silently begging someone to tell them it was time to leave. But none of them left, held captive by a horror that went beyond logic. It seemed that the house would not allow them to leave this discovery, not yet. A few seconds later, a crash sounded in the corridor, somewhere behind the door they had forced open. They froze, their breath catching in their chests. The worst part was how distinct the sound was, as if the door had slammed shut, locking them inside. In the awkward silence that followed, Marcus stood there clutching the old book in his hands as if it were something precious. He did not try to hide the evil light in his eyes. For a moment, none of them spoke. None of them had to. The realization sank in. They were not just exploring an abandoned house, they were awakening it. Silence fell over the group as they returned to the corridor, Marcus clutching the leather-bound book like a sacred reward. The floorboards underfoot seemed to sigh and groan with every step, as if to protest their intrusion. The single light bulb in the corridor still flickered, painting the walls in fuzzy patterns of light and shadow. Their earlier bravado had vanished, leaving each of them with a shuddering sense of vulnerability. They could still hear a slow, rhythmic scraping somewhere below, or perhaps behind the walls. From time to time, a dull thudding sound would be heard on the floor, like heavy footsteps in a distant room. Dina, close to tears, finally spoke. "Marcus, we have to go. That book, whatever it is, just leave it." Her voice was trembling, the words coming out of her mouth in a pleading rush. But Marcus shook his head. "You don't understand," he whispered, clutching the book tighter. "I dreamed of this. It's bigger than us." He said it with such conviction that Eva's stomach turned. She stared at Marcus as if she were seeing him for the first time. He had never spoken about this before. She looked at Will and Dina, who had the same look of fear on their faces. An instant thought flashed through her mind. Marcus knew exactly what he was coming for today. In the corridor, the door to their left stood ajar. The only source of light inside was the moon, which cast a pale glow on the curved floor. Marcus slipped inside, and the others reluctantly followed. This room was an old bedroom. The rusted bed frame leaned against one wall. The mattress was torn to shreds, its springs sticking out like twisted metal ribs. The tattered wallpaper, once a cheerful pastel color, hung in dirty strips. Opposite the bed stood a dressing table with a large oval mirror, its glass stained and cracked, reflecting only vague outlines. Marcus placed the book on the dressing table, flipping through pages of strange symbols and half-faded illustrations. Eva couldn't suppress a shudder as the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The broken reflection of the mirror made the shadows look like creeping figures behind them. She forced herself not to stare too long, afraid of what she might see. "Marcus," Will said in a low and insistent voice. "What's going on with you?" Marcus looked back over his shoulder, his eyes sparkling. Dust swirling in the air caught the flashlight's beam, dissipating like ash. "I found references to this house in some old notes about rituals," he admitted, his tone raw with excitement and something dark. "I didn't tell anyone because I needed you all here. I needed to prove that it was real." It took a moment for his words to sink in. A pit formed in Eva's stomach. "You're saying it was some kind of ritual place?" He nodded, flipping to another page, where a terrifying illustration of a figure with empty eyes stared back at her. "I think whoever lived here was trying to contact something, or summon it." Dina laughed strangely. "That's crazy." No one contradicted her. The longer they stood in that bedroom, the more they felt something malignant at the core of the house, like a monster slowly waking from a dream. A sudden thud from the opposite side of the bedroom wall made them all jump. This was followed by a crunching sound, like nails dragging on wood. Without warning, the bedroom door slammed behind them. Will rushed to the doorknob, pulling on it, but the wood wouldn't budge. There was no lock to speak of, only an old brass knob stuck tightly, as if held by an immeasurable force from the outside. In a panic, Eva rushed to the mirror, intending to throw it at the door to break the glass and draw attention, or perhaps use the shard to rip the handle out. But in her reflection, she saw a figure standing right behind Will, where no one should be. She was dressed in a tattered dress or cloak, her face covered by a curtain of shadow. Eva turned around, her heart clenching in her chest. There was nothing there but Will himself, pushing her shoulder into the door. And yet her skin tingled with certainty she saw someone else in that mirror. I just saw something," she gasped, pointing with a trembling finger. "Behind you." Will turned around, his breath catching. "Stop, don't say that." A metallic clang drew their attention to Marcus as he rummaged through his dressing table drawer and pulled out a small silver-bladed antique letter opener, stained with rust. Its pointed tip glistened in the moonlight. Dina's voice trembled. "Marcus, what are you doing?" He barely glanced at her. His eyes were fixed on the book, and he ran his finger over the words. "The ritual," he muttered. "It's the only way to open the door again. We have to do it. All of us." A wave of nausea swept through Eva. "Marcus, this isn't funny," she said, her voice breaking. "Stop joking." His next words filled the cramped room with paralyzing fear. "Who said I was joking?" A final, strong thud sounded in the corridor, shaking the door in its frame, as if someone was testing the barrier for strength. Something fierce. The house seemed to hold its breath, and so did they. Each of the friends realizing with increasing horror that they were no longer alone. Worse, that to leave they would have to open a door that was better left firmly closed. Marcus's knuckles turned white around the silver blade. The weight of his words held them in place. "We have to do this. All of us." In the cracked reflection of the mirror, they all looked pale, their eyes flickering with terror like sparks in a dying fire. Behind the door, something was scraping slowly, deliberately. Eva tried to calm her breathing as she stared at the strange symbols in the book. "Marcus, you don't even know what this ritual does." His gaze was feverish. "I know enough." He jabbed a trembling finger at the pages. Dark ink illustrations of twisted shapes seemed to shift under a thin layer of dust. "He's going to let us out." Will slammed his shoulder against the door again, but to no avail. Dina clutched Eva's hand, her trembling increasing with each heartbeat. And the house was still groaning around them, that tugging sound getting closer. Then the light overhead flashed, plunging them into moonlit darkness. In the mirror behind Marcus, a woman's silhouette flashed, her face hidden, her long hair swaying. Eva's scream stuck in her throat. When the lights went back on, there was no one else there. Marcus raised the blade. "Help me," he demanded. The handle rattled outside. "We're running out of time." Marcus recited the spell in a low, insistent voice. The syllables tore through the silence like barbed wire. Eva and Dina clung to each other, pale and shivering, and Will hovered by the door, still pulling the useless handle. Something was banging on the other side, rattling in tandem with every garbled phrase Marcus spoke. A sudden roar of wind swept through the room. The mirror on the dressing table shattered, and fragments flew all over the walls. Dina screamed and covered her face with her hands. Eva saw the same veiled figure reaching for Marcus in the debris, and then the vision disappeared, replaced by pitch blackness as the light bulb overhead exploded. The doors swung open. Light from the corridor spilled in, but it was flickering, tinged with an unearthly red glow. Marcus swayed on his feet, clutching the book to his chest. His eyes rolled back. His lips continued to form words long after he had stopped speaking them aloud. "Run!" shouted Eva, pulling Dina and Will with her. The three of them rushed into the hallway, and Marcus staggered after them. But the house was no longer asleep. The walls pulsed with an inhuman heartbeat. Doorways gaped in blackness that seemed to move. They ran down the stairs, their footsteps echoing like gunshots. At the threshold, the front door opened into the night. The icy air hit them in the face. All four of them jumped out, hearts pounding, leaving debris behind them. Only when they hit the dead grass did Eva realize that Marcus had dropped the book somewhere in the darkness. A single light glowed in the upstairs window, a last, mocking beacon. Then it went out. Neither of them spoke as they ran down the empty street. But later, each of them heard it, a whisper behind their ear when they were alone, or the soft click of a door closing in the night. They had taken something from that house, or perhaps it had taken something from them. And every Halloween that followed, they carried that darkness with them, like an invisible stain. Every nighttime wiggle, every figure in the corner of their vision, they never knew if it was a nightmare or a reminder that the house was still beckoning them, ready to take them away one by one.